During the Battle of Midway, the Japanese simultaneously invaded the Aleutian Islands. In 1943, the Allies began a campaign to recapture the Aleutians. Of all the battles, Attu was the fiercest, and it ended with an enormous Banzai charge on par with the last stand of Saigo Takamori and his samurai at the Battle of Shiroyama. This episode is The Battle of Attu, Blood, Blizzards, and Banzai. On June the 7th of 1942, Vice Admiral Bushido Hosogai landed a force of 1,140 infantry led by Major General Matsutoshi Hozumi at Holtz Bay, facing very little resistance. The Japanese constructed an airbase and fortifications and would be periodically bombarded by Allied aircraft and naval forces. By May of 1943, the Attu garrison was 2,630 men strong, led by Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki, designated the 2nd District North Seas Garrison. Amongst the Japanese was a medical officer, Dr. Paul Nabuo Tetsuguchi, assigned to the garrison field hospital. He wrote extensively in his diary of the battle, and it would survive the war. On May the 11th of 1943, the Americans unleashed Operation Landcrab, the recapture of Attu. The plan was to bypass Kiska and hit Attu first in the hopes the Japanese would simply abandon Kiska afterwards. The operation would be carried out by 15,000 men of Major General Albert Brown's 7th Division, under the overall command of Admiral Francis Rockwell. Major General William Butler's 11th Air Force unleashed an intense bombing campaign in April against Kiska to try and deceive the Japanese of their intentions, before switching to bombing Attu in early May. Operation Landcrab saw Colonel Frank Cullen's 1st Battalion, 17th Regiment land at Red Beach on Holtz Bay, designated Northern Force. Colonel Edward Earle's 2nd and 3rd Battalion, 17th Regiment, and 2nd Battalion, 32nd Regiment landed at Blue and Yellow Beaches at Massacre Bay, designated Southern Force. Yet before both of them, Captain William Willoughby's 7th Scout Company and 7th Cavalry Reconnaissance Troops would land at Scarlet Beach, designated Provisional Scout Battalion. Held in reserve would be regiments of the 32nd and 4th. Hey everyone, I just wanted to let you know I now have a Patreon account found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Over there you can find exclusive Patreon episodes and podcasts based on suggestions from patrons, and other benefits like early access to all of my content, live hangouts, your name in the end credits, and much, much more, so please go check it out. All three forces were to link up in the mountain passes between Massacre and Holtz Valley, trapping the Japanese within Chicha Gulf, where combined with air and naval bombardment, they would be destroyed. Yamazaki received intelligence that the Americans could invade as early as May the 4th. He chose not to contest the enemy at the beaches, as he simply did not have the numbers to do so. Instead, he kept a small garrison at Chicha Gulf Harbor, and the rest of his forces manned rifle pits, trenches, and bunkers on the high grounds overlooking the valleys. They would perform delaying actions until the Aegean reinforced or evacuated them, or to their bitter death. The American landings went uncontested. The terrain was a mixture of mud, snow, and muskeg, making the movement of supplies an absolute nightmare. The 105mm howitzers became quickly stuck on the beaches. Over Massacre Valley, 2 companies of the 303rd Independent Battalion awaited the Americans in their concealed chain of machine gun nets and mortar positions. At 6 p.m., the first shots came from Brigadier General Archibald Arnold's artillery that were stuck on the beaches. Southern Force advanced through snow and mud, unable to see the Japanese in the foggy white heights, while the Japanese clearly saw them below. While artillery fired upon the heights, Japanese snipers, machine guns, and mortars rained down upon the Americans. The Americans fell back and dug in. To the north, Willoughby's scouts advanced, encountering no Japanese on their first day. Just a bit of friendly fire from Nassau's Wildcats, who strafed the rubber boats, and some cases of frostbite. The Americans were all equipped with insulated leather hunting boots that, when wet, would soak through, causing countless cases of hypothermia, trench foot, and terrible frostbite. Northern Force advanced as Japanese artillery pounded Beach Red. It would dig in 800 yards from Hill X. On the 12th, the USS Nevada bombarded the ridges of Massacre Valley as the Americans assaulted Jarmin Pass through some open ground, being absolutely devastated by crossfire from machine guns and motors from both flanks. The Americans would be driven back twice. During the combat, Colonel Earle, while visiting the front lines, was killed by a Japanese sniper. Colonel Wayne Zimmerman would take command afterwards. To the north, Willoughby's scouts emerged to the rear of the Japanese at Hill X. The Japanese quickly spotted them and launched a preemptive attack, pinning them down. Simultaneously, Northern Force advanced against their right flank with support from some artillery, Wildcats, and the USS Nevada. By the end of the day, they occupied a ridge leading up to Hill X. Operation Landcrab was expected to be a 3-day battle, but General Brown now understood the muddy terrain and Japanese fierce resistance was going to prolong it, so he began requesting reinforcements from Admiral Rockwell, receiving the 2nd Battalion, 32nd Infantry Regiment of Major Charles Frederick. On the 13th, the Southern Force attacked Jarmin's Pass again, managing to get within 600 yards from its entrance before the Japanese machine gun, rifle, and mortar fire drove them back. They would spend their night fighting off Japanese infiltrators in their rear. At this point, 4 American battalions were committed against 2 Japanese companies defending Jarmin and Clevesy Pass. Meanwhile, Willoughby's scouts and Northern Force simultaneously assaulted and successfully captured Hill X with artillery, Wildcat, and naval support. Afterwards, the 3rd Battalion, 32nd Regiment landed at Scarlet Beach to reinforce them. Dr. Tatsuguchi noted on May the 13th in his diary, "Our 2 submarines from Kiska assisted us have greatly damaged 2 enemy ships. The enemy has advanced to the bottom of Mizumiyama. First Lieutenant Tsuyuki died by shots from rifle. Continuous flow of wounded in the field hospital. Took refuge in the trenches during daytime and took care of the patients during the bombardment. Enemy strength must be a division. Our desperate defense is holding up well." On the 14th, the Southern Force assaulted Jarmin's Pass at 11 a.m. with artillery, naval, and Wildcat support, but the extreme weather saw 3 Wildcats crash as the infantry got just within 300 yards of the pass entrance before being driven back. Captain John Jarmin died during the assault against the pass that received his name later. Another failed assault was launched, and during the night, Colonel Zimmerman relieved the 3rd Battalion, 17th Regiment, finding their commander, Major James Montague, in a state of shock from the horrifying losses. The 2nd Battalion, 32nd Regiment replaced them at the front. Blue and Yellow Beach were clogged up with supplies, and now the artillery was delaying the advance. To the north, the USS Nevada finally neutralized the Japanese artillery on the western arm of Holtz Bay, allowing the Red Beach's unloading and deployment of artillery to go smoother. Northern Force and Willoughby's scouts launched an assault into Holtz Bay. Willoughby's men had been fighting non-stop for days, and they had no more provisions. His force had suffered only 11 deaths, but out of his 420 men, they now had 255 casualties. Their only chance of survival was to link up with Northern Force. They fought so fiercely, the Japanese believed their unit to be much larger than it actually was. As a result, Yamasaki would pull the men back to Moore Ridge, not wanting them to be pincered. Dr. Tatsuguchi noted on the 14th, "A continuous flow of wounded to our field hospital caused by the fierce bombardment of the enemy land and naval forces. The West Arm units have withdrawn to near Shitagati-dai in a raid. I was ordered to the West Arm, but it was called off. Just lay down from fatigue in the barracks. Facial expression of the soldiers back from the West Arm is tense. They all want back to the firing line soon." On the 15th, Willoughby and the Northern Force finally made contact as they advanced towards Moore's Ridge. The southern beaches remained in a traffic jam. Brown's reports of how dire the situation was were not reaching external commanders because of faulty communications. So Brown traveled aboard Admiral Rockwell's flagship, the USS Pennsylvania, to report to him directly. Brown requested the 1st Battalion, 4th Regiment to be landed alongside road construction equipment. Admiral Kincaid heard about the requests, without any context of what was going on in Attu. He was completely irritated, believing Brown was needlessly turning a 3-day battle into one of weeks, if not months. Admiral Kincaid met with General John Dewitt and Major General Simon Buckner. Both men disliked Brown, and it was agreed they would be relieving him with Major General Eugene Landrum. Likewise, Admiral Rockwell would be pulling out the bulk of his warships as they were very low in high-explosive shells, and sitting ducks if the IGN offered a battle. Dr. Tatsuguchi noted on the 15th, "If Shitagati-dai, Moore Ridge, is taken by the enemy, the fate of the East Arm is decided. So orders were given to destroy all the wounded soldiers by giving them shots in the arms and die painlessly. At the last minute, there was an order from Headquarters Sector Unit to proceed to Chichagov Harbor by the way of Umanose, Fishhook Ridge. On the 16th, General Landrum arrived at Yellow Beach and relieved General Brown. The men had a quick and awkward meeting. Landrum endorsed Brown's ongoing war plan and acknowledged the other commanders did not understand the reality of the situation. His loss of command was not his fault. The Southern Force launched an assault against Jarmin's Pass with the same terrible results. To the north, Northern Force began assaulting Moore Ridge, quickly becoming pinned down on the valley floor. A company advanced across the extremely steep slope and performed a right flank maneuver, seeing hand-to-hand combat, managing to secure a position on the ridge during the night. The rest of the battalion seized the top north end of the ridge, gaining a foothold. The Japanese on Moore Ridge had run out of food. Many were demoralized. They left their positions and would attack the Americans to be put out of their misery. Yamasaki realized their plight and he ordered Moore Ridge and Jarmin's Pass to be abandoned. They would now defend Clevesy Pass, Fishhook, and Prendergast Ridge. On the 17th at around midnight, Northern Force launched a night attack, only to find Moore Ridge completely abandoned. Northern Force consolidated their new position and shifted their artillery at Red Beach to Holtz Bay. Likewise, Southern Force found Jarmin's Pass abandoned, as the 1st Battalion, 4th Regiment landed at Yellow Beach. Dr. Tetsuguchi wrote this on the night of the 17th. The Yonakawa detachment abandoned East and West Arm and withdrew to Imanose. About 60 wounded came to the field hospital. I had to care for all of them by myself all through the night. Heard that the enemy carried out a landing at Chichigov Harbor. Everyone did combat preparations and waited. Had 2 grenades ready. The 18th saw an end to the amphibious phase of the campaign. Admiral Rockwell pulled the majority of his warships out, and now the Americans would seize the high grounds around Chichigov Harbor. Now there was 11,500 American troops on Attu. They had already suffered 1,100 casualties, 500 from exposure. Landrum gave his men a day to reorganize themselves. The Southern Force would capture Clevesy Pass, the Northern Force Prendergast Ridge. Then they would link up. The Southern Force continued constructing roads to allow their cumbersome artillery to advance further inland. On the 19th, the offensive began with an artillery and aerial bombardment of the Japanese along the heights. The Southern Force was able to get atop Clevesy Pass, but the Japanese held the fortified mountain position of Point Able, holding them back. Lieutenant Samuel Clevesy of H Company, 2nd Battalion, 17th Regiment was killed by a Japanese sniper, thus giving his name to the pass. Meanwhile, the Northern Force was fighting fiercely, only advancing a few hundred yards by the end of the day. Late that day, the fresh 1st Battalion, 4th Regiment entered the battle, advancing through Clevesy Pass to assault Prendergast Ridge from the south. They managed to get atop Prendergast Ridge during the night, and they would soon advance upon Sarana Holtz Bay. While advancing, Lieutenant Joseph Prendergast of B Company, 4th Regiment was killed by a Japanese machine gunner, thus giving his name to the ridge. Dr. Tetsuguchi would write on the 19th, "The hard fighting of our 303rd Battalion in Massacre Bay is fierce, and it is to our advantage. Have captured enemy weapons and used that to fight the enemy closing in under fog. 5 of our men and 1 medical NCO died. Heard that enemy pilots dropped several bombs near Omanose. The enemy naval gun firing near our hospital is fierce, stopping about 30 yards away." The USS Nassau would launch its final sortie of Wildcats that bombed and strafed Japanese positions within Chichigov Harbor at a very high cost. 5 of the 8 Wildcats were lost. Dr. Tetsuguchi wrote on the 20th, "Was strafed when noon, and the deck crew launched 4 Wildcats amputating a patient's arm. It is the first time since at 1:30 p.m., followed by 4 more flights of 4 moving over Chichigov Harbor, that I went in between 3:40 and 5:50. The pilots bombed an air raid shelter. Nervous of our CO is severe, and he has said his last word to his officers and NCOs that he will die tomorrow, gave all his articles away. Hasty chap, this fellow. The officers on the front are doing a fine job." Everyone heard this became desperate, and things became disorderly. The following morning, bombers of the 11th Air Force, led by Colonel Erickson, bombed and destroyed every building within Chichigov Village. On the 21st, the Southern Force assaulted Point Able, with Company E of the 32nd Regiment charging the hill, killing every single Japanese of the enemy company. Meanwhile, the Northern Force was securing most of the western portion of Prendergast Ridge. Dr. Tetsuguchi would write on the 21st, "At 6 a.m., strafing killed 1 medical man. Okayaki, wounded in the right thigh and fractured arm. During the night, a mortar shell came awfully close. While the Battle of Attu raged on, Japanese Imperial HQ issued Directive Number 246, Operation KE, to evacuate Kiska using submarines and, if possible, Attu. But the Allied blockade and terrible weather would never permit Attu to be evacuated. The men there were doomed. On the 22nd, 15 Betty bombers of the 24th Air Flotilla from Peromashiro unsuccessfully bombed the American vessels and dropped provisions over Chichagof Harbor. The Southern Force advanced past Point Able, and they were halted by Japanese atop Sarana Nose. The Americans unleashed 32 heavy machine guns, 14 37mm anti-tank guns, 23 81mm mortars, a section of 75mm howitzers, and 4 105mm howitzers. The coordinated simultaneous fire upon the Japanese absolutely broke them. The 3rd Battalion 17th Regiment stormed Sarana Nose, only to find dazed remnants of Major Watanabe's 303rd Battalion. Meanwhile, the 1st Battalion 4th Regiment and Northern Force stormed the Japanese atop Prendergast Ridge, pushing them down to the eastern side of the ridge, as Southern Force advanced into Jim Hook Valley. Yamasaki's forces were now pushed to their innermost defensive perimeter. Despite the enormous casualties, now Yamasaki's men were more concentrated and thus even deadlier. They sought to exact maximum casualties upon the Americans as possible. Dr. Tetsuguchi wrote this on the 22nd. By naval gun firing, a hit was scored on the pillar pole of tents for patients, and the tent gave in and 2 died instantly. From 2 a.m. in the morning until 4 p.m. stayed in foxholes. The day's rations, 1 go. 1.5 pounds of food, nothing more. Everybody looked around for food and stole everything they could find. On the 23rd, Northern Force linked up with Southern Force as 16 Bettys came to bomb the American positions, but they were intercepted by 5 P-38 Lightnings of the 18th Fighter Squadron, who managed to shoot down 9 of them at the cost of 2 Lightnings. Dr. Tetsuguchi wrote this on the 23rd. It sleeted and was extremely cold. Stayed in Musumi Barracks alone. A great number of shells were dropped by naval gunfire. Rocks and mud fall all over the roof. It fell down, in a foxhole about 50 yards away. Hayasaki, a medical man, died instantly by a piece of shrapnel through the heart. On the 24th, both forces coordinated a simultaneous assault against the Holtz Bay Chichagof Harbor Pass with artillery and aerial support. 2 sorties of B-24s and B-25s dropped 15.5 a ton of bombs, prompting war correspondent Howard Handelman to describe it as the best air show of the war for Attu. Meanwhile, Landrum had his artillery dragged up the newly built road in Massacre Valley, which aided the men to take Holtz-Sarana Pass and Newman Peak on the 25th. On the 26th, Private Joe Martinez of K Company heroically led his men through enemy fire, personally storming Japanese trenches, killing 5 Japanese with grenades and bar fire. He seized the crest of Fishhook Ridge before dying from his wounds and would posthumously receive the Medal of Honor. Now the only obstacle between the Americans and directly firing upon Chichagof Harbor was Buffalo Ridge. Dr. Tetsuguchi would write a lot over the next 3 days. On the 24th, naval gun firing, aerial bombardment, trench warfare, the worst is yet to come. The enemy is constructing a position. Commander died at Umanose. They cannot accommodate their patients. It has been said at Massacre Bay District, the road coming through Sector Unit Headquarters is completely isolated. I'm suffering from diarrhea and feeling dizzy. On May the 25th, consciousness becomes vague. 1 tent burnt down by a hit from incendiary bombs. Strafing planes hit the next room. 2 hits from 50 caliber shell. 1 stopped in the ceiling and the other penetrated. My room is an awful mess from sand and pebbles that have come from the roof. First Lieutenant from Medical Corps is wounded. There was a ceremony to grant the Imperial Edict. The last line of Umanose was broken through. No hope for reinforcements. Will die for the cause of Imperial Edict. On May the 26th, diarrhea broke out and continues steady, pains severe. Took everything in pills, morphine and opium. Then everybody slept well. Strafing by planes. Roof broke through. There are less than 700 left from more than 3,500. Wounded from coast defense units. Field hospital held post office. The rest are on the firing line. On the 27th, the Americans were clawing their way 200 yards from Buffalo Ridge's crest. The next day, they unleashed artillery upon the crest before storming it to find very little resistance, as the Japanese were now all concentrating within Chichagof. Landcrab now held the high ground, surrounding Chichagof harbor. He began assembling his artillery and forces for a final drive against Yamasaki's men set for May the 28th. Landcrab began airdropping leaflets stating Yamasaki and his men performed worthy of the highest military tradition, and requested he send a delegation to them under a white flag of truce to avoid senseless loss of life. Yamasaki and his surviving 800 men were now cornered. Their backs were to the sea. Their position was untenable, open flat grounds with little concealment. After reading the leaflets, Yamasaki chose for himself and for his men to go out like the last samurai of Saigo Takamori upon Shiroyama. Yamasaki ordered a mass counterattack in the form of a massive Banzai charge, directed at the American artillery position on Engineer Hill. They would charge through Jim Hook Valley, capture the artillery, turn it upon the enemy, and destroy as much of the supply depot there as possible before fleeing into the southern mountains, perhaps to survive as guerrillas until a rescue operation could be properly mounted. It was to be the first time a full Japanese garrison would perform a Banzai charge. It was a fool's gambit. Dr. Tatsuguchi would write his final diary entry on the 28th. Today at 8 p.m. we assembled in front of HQ. The field hospital took part 2. The last assault is to be carried out. All the patients in the hospital were made to commit suicide. Only 33 years of living and I am to die here. I have no regrets. Banzai to the Emperor. I am grateful I have my beloved wife, who loved me to the last. Until we meet again, grant you Godspeed. Misako, who just became 4 years old, will grow up unhindered. I feel sorry for you. Itsuko, born in February this year, will never see your father. Goodbye. Accounts later indicate Dr. Tatsuguchi was killed by gunfire or grenades by either Master Sergeant William Laird or Private John Hearn. On the morning of the 29th, Yamasaki led his 800 starving men in a wild charge through the narrow confines between Lake Corries and the lower slopes of Fishhook Ridge. They smashed into Company B, 32nd Regiment, who were having their breakfast far to the rear of their prepared positions. The Americans were taken by complete surprise, quickly overwhelmed as they fled up Buffalo Ridge for safety. Yamasaki's force continued to charge down Jim Fish Valley, across Siddons Valley, crashing into the 3rd Battalion, 17th Regiment, causing massive casualties. The Japanese paused to waste nearly 30 minutes killing helpless patients at the medical station there. As Nisei interpreter Peter Nakao recalled, "It was pitch black when the enemy began the Banzai attack. All of a sudden the enemy was upon us. We could see not anything in the darkness except for tracer bullets flying in every direction, leaving bayoneted dead and wounded behind them. The Japanese went past us and continued to the medical unit stationed to our rear. Then they headed for the ammunition dump behind the medics." The element of surprise was now lost as Yamasaki continued his Banzai charge up Engineer Hill. Upon Engineer Hill, General Arnold received word of the incoming attack and he organized his service troops, artillerymen, and engineers without automatic weapons to man every defensible position that they possibly could. They met the Japanese charge with grenades and artillery fire, and once within meters distance, bayonet versus bayonet. The 4th Regiment rushed to the scene, engaging the enemy in hand-to-hand combat. Yamasaki performed a second Banzai charge, but the momentum and element of surprise had all been lost. Wielding his ancestral katana, Yamasaki charged into the enemy, and he was killed by an M1 Garand bullet. The nearly 500 Japanese survivors were pushed back and slowly surrounded. Through the fog, some Americans saw a Japanese man stand up, speak to the rest of them, before all of them held grenades to their stomachs and blew themselves up. War correspondent Robert Sherrotte described the aftermath. "The explosion charge blasted away their vital organs. Probably 1 in 4 held a grenade against his head. There were many headless Jap bodies between Masker Bay and Chichagof. Sometimes the grenades split the head in half, leaving the right face on one shoulder, the left face on the other. 2 bodies were burned to crisps, one atop the other, fused into one charred hump. And with that, they had nearly all killed themselves." The Battle of Attu saw 2,872 Japanese killed in action or commit suicide. Only 28 men would be captured. The Americans had suffered 549 deaths, 1,148 wounded, 1,200 exposure injuries, with another 614 sick. Often overlooked, the Battle of Attu was akin to many battles in the South Pacific in its brutality and loss of life. For Yamasaki and those who performed the Banzai charge, it was a samurai's death. Shortly after the battle, the Americans erected a wooded interpretive sign at the foot of Clevesy Pass, honoring their enemy. It was a rare gesture and remains there today, replaced in 1950 with a bronze marker.